Here's a question nobody asks until it's too late. What happens the day your own child decides you're easier to manage than to love? Not cruel about it, not shouting, just quiet, efficient, the way you'd handle a broken appliance. My daughter stood in a law office on the ninth floor of a building on Superior Avenue and told a stranger I couldn't remember my own name anymore. She wasn't lying to hurt me. She believed it. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. My name is Harold Feinstein, 69 years old. For 32 years, I ran Feinstein Hardware on Detroit Avenue in Lakewood, Ohio, 3 blocks from the lake, in a building my father bought in 1962 with a loan he paid off in 11 years working 6 days a week. He used to tell me the shop wasn't really about nails and hinges at all. It was about being the kind of man a neighborhood could count on, and I didn't fully understand what he meant by that until years after he was gone. I sold nails, hinges, paint, and advice nobody asked for. I closed the shop in 2019 when my knees stopped agreeing with the stairs to the stockroom. My wife Ruth used to say I could fix anything except my own stubbornness. She passed in March of 2021. Since then, it's just me in the brick 2-story on Clifton Boulevard, a 2008 Buick LeSabre, the color of moss that I still change the oil on myself every 5,000 miles, and a basement workbench where I take apart old pocket watches and put them back together slower than I used to. The shop itself is gone now, sold to a chain that turned it into a phone repair store, but the building still has my father's original tin ceiling if you know to look up. I used to open at 7, sweep the sidewalk myself, even after I could afford to pay someone else to do it, and know every regular customer's name along with what they were actually building, not just what they bought. Ruth ran the books in the back office for the first 15 years until her hands started giving her trouble, and after that she still came in Saturdays just to sit near the register and talk to whoever wandered by. People used to say the Feinsteins knew everybody on that stretch of Detroit Avenue. I never thought of it as anything special. It was just Tuesday. I have one daughter, Denise, 44, a real estate agent out in Westlake, married to a man named Craig who sells insurance and laughs a half second too late at his own jokes. I have a grandson, Tyler, 16, who I call every Sunday at 6 and who picks up maybe 1 week in 4. I'm not special. I want to say that clearly before anything else. I just sold nails and hinges for 30 years. Nothing special about that. That's what I tell people. It's mostly true. What isn't in that sentence is the part I never explained to anyone, not even Ruth, not fully. But that comes later. Let me tell you how it started. It started small, the way these things usually do. Denise called in March, breezy. The kind of call that isn't really a call. It's a scheduling notification with a human voice attached. She said she and Craig were going to handle my eye doctor appointments from now on, since I'd missed the March one. I hadn't missed it. She'd called and rescheduled it herself without telling me, then framed the rescheduled date as a miss when I showed up the wrong week. I didn't argue. I figured it was a mix-up. Then in April, my storage unit on Sloan Avenue, where I kept Ruth's boxes and my father's old shop ledgers, had a new lock on it. Denise had the code changed. When I asked her about it, she said Craig thought the old lock looked flimsy, that they'd upgraded it for my safety, that she'd meant to give me the new code and forgot. I believed that one too, for about a week. Then in May, at Easter dinner at Denise's house on a cul-de-sac in Westlake with the good china out and Tyler on his phone under the table, I forgot the name of my blood pressure medication for maybe 4 seconds. Everybody forgets a word sometimes. I said, the little white one. The heart one, and Craig laughed that half second too late and said, "Careful, Harold, we're keeping notes." Nobody else laughed. Denise didn't laugh either. She wrote something down on her phone. I saw her do it. I didn't say anything. There was a fourth thing too, smaller than the others, easy to miss if you weren't already paying attention. In late May, my neighbor Dottie Marsh, who's lived across the street on Clifton Boulevard since before Ruth and I moved in, mentioned in passing that a moving company had come by for an estimate while I was out getting groceries. I hadn't called any moving company. When I asked Denise about it that evening, she said Craig had set it up just to get a sense of costs in case, and that she'd meant to mention it and it slipped her mind. I want to be fair here. Any one of these things, taken alone, is nothing. A missed appointment. A changed lock somebody forgot to update me on. A moving estimate that slipped her mind. It's only when you line them up end to end, the way I eventually did on a legal pad at my kitchen table one night in early June, that you see the shape of something being built underneath you, one small brick at a time, without your permission. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. The morning it stopped being small was a Tuesday in June the 9th, 10:40 in the morning. I remember because I'd just come back from the hardware store, the new owners, buying a replacement washer for the kitchen faucet, $7.40, and the phone rang. It was Dr. Patricia Wembley's office, my family doctor for 11 years, a practice on Detroit Avenue 2 miles from my old shop. The receptionist said Denise had called that morning to confirm a cognitive assessment scheduled for me that Thursday. I told her there was some mistake. I hadn't scheduled anything. She checked the file and read me the note. It said the appointment had been requested by the patient's daughter, healthcare proxy, due to reported memory lapses including medication confusion and repeated missed appointments. I stood in my kitchen holding a $7 faucet washer and realized my daughter had made herself my healthcare proxy without telling me and had built a paper trail to prove I needed one. Everything holds until it doesn't. You just have to know which screw is loose. I'd said that line in my shop for 32 years, mostly about cabinet hinges, sometimes about marriages, sometimes about people. Standing in my kitchen that Tuesday, I said it to myself for a different reason entirely, and I didn't like where the thought was going. Before I called Miriam, I did something I'm not proud of. I called Denise and asked her, straight out, why she'd made herself my healthcare proxy without telling me. She didn't deny it. She said, "Dad, you're 69. Craig and I just think it's smart to have things in place before there's an emergency. That's all this is." I asked her why the doctor's office had a note about medication confusion and missed appointments that I had no memory of causing. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear Craig's television in the background. "I might have described the eye doctor thing a little more dramatically than it needed to be," she said, "to get them to take the assessment seriously. I didn't think it would end up in writing like that." I asked her whether she understood what a written medical record like that could actually be used for. She said I was overreacting. She said it in the exact tone I remembered her using at 9 years old when she'd broken a lamp and insisted it had simply fallen on its own. If you're new here, this is the part where things start moving fast, so stick with me. I called my oldest friend that night, a man named Gus Papadakis, who ran the auto shop next to mine on Detroit Avenue for just as long as I ran hardware. Gus didn't ask why I was calling at 9 at night. He just said, "What do you need, Harold?" The same way he'd said it in 1994 when my transmission died 2 days before Ruth's due date. I told him what I'd found out. He was quiet for a second, then he said, "You're not going to like what I say next, but you need a lawyer, not a friend with a wrench." He gave me a name. Miriam Okafor, 22 years practicing elder law in Cuyahoga County. I called her office the next morning. But before I get to Miriam, and before I tell you what I did in the 8 months after that phone call, there's something I never told Denise. Something I never told anyone in this family except Ruth once in 1996 over a kitchen table, and she never brought it up again because that's the kind of woman she was. I called Gus that night. He didn't ask why. Only then, let me explain something nobody knew about me. When my father sold the building on Detroit Avenue to me for $1 in 1987, there was a second, smaller transaction nobody in the family knew about. A trust. Not a large one by the standards of people who talk about money at dinner parties, but large enough. 41 years of a hardware store that quietly held the mortgage paper on 6 other small businesses along that same stretch of Detroit Avenue, collecting modest, steady interest. Nobody in my family ever thought to ask about because nobody in my family ever thought their father, the man who sold nails, had money to ask about. I wasn't hiding a fortune. I was hiding the fact that I understood exactly what money does to people who think you don't have any, and I'd built my whole retirement around never letting anyone find out until they showed me who they really were first. That's not why I built it. I built it because my own father died broke at 71 after 40 years of work, and Ruth and I swore that would never happen to us or to Denise. But it turned out to matter for a different reason than the one we planned for. Miriam Okafor's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, a corner office with a view of nothing in particular, a stack of files 3 feet high, and a way of looking at you over her glasses that told you she'd heard every version of this story before and was not going to be impressed by mine until she'd checked it herself. I told her everything: the eye doctor, the storage unit, the cognitive assessment I hadn't agreed to. She asked one question that changed the direction of everything that came after. "Who's the doctor?" I told her. "Patricia Wembley." Miriam wrote the name down without looking up, then set her pen down carefully, the way you set something down when you don't quite trust your hand to do it gently otherwise. Miriam went very still, the way people go still when a fact lands somewhere they weren't expecting. She asked me to wait a moment, pulled a thin folder from a locked drawer, and set it on the desk between us without opening it yet. "Harold," she said, "I need you to understand something before we go further. You are not the first person who's called me about Dr. Wembley this year." I didn't understand what that meant yet. I want you to sit with that uncertainty for a second, the way I had to, because what came next wasn't really about Denise anymore. It became about something bigger and slower and colder, hiding underneath my daughter's fear about money she thought she was owed. Thank you for sticking with the story this far. If this is landing for you, the like button really does help more people find it, so go ahead and tap it now before we keep going. The folder Miriam opened contained a name I didn't recognize: Eleanor Vance, 74, a retired school teacher who lived 4 miles from me in Rocky River, the kind of woman who still graded her former students' kids' spelling tests when they brought them by out of habit. Her son, Peter, had filed a guardianship petition against her in March, citing early cognitive decline, documented by, of all people, Dr. Patricia Wembley. Eleanor had contacted a lawyer of her own after she overheard Peter on the phone with a real estate agent discussing the sale of her house before any guardianship had even been granted, a house she'd lived in for 46 years and taught piano lessons out of on Tuesday afternoons. I asked how the case had ended. Miriam said it hadn't ended yet. It was still active. Eleanor was still fighting it, alone, without the kind of resources I was about to find out I had. I want to be careful here, because at first I thought, well, coincidence. Doctors have a lot of patience. But then came Frank Dombrowski, 78, a retired city bus driver whose daughter had petitioned in January after he'd gotten lost driving home from a route he'd taken for 30 years. Once, in a snowstorm that closed 2 exits on I-90 that same night for every other driver too. Then came Alice Kwan, 81, petition filed the previous November, her nephew this time, not a child, a nephew who stood to inherit her duplex in Lakewood if the guardianship went through before she could update her will. Then came a man named Robert Szymanski, a retired steelworker, and a widow named June Castellano, who'd buried 2 husbands and, according to Miriam's notes, cried through most of her own competency, hearing not from confusion but from grief nobody in her family had bothered to ask about. And by the time Miriam finished reading, 6 names in 18 months, every single one a patient of Dr. Patricia Wembley, every single one with the exact same 3 words typed into their chart by the exact same hand: mild cognitive decline. Not a diagnosis with tests behind it. A phrase, a door that, once written down, was very hard for a family member to argue against in front of a judge who didn't know the family and had 40 other cases on the docket that morning. Miriam slid a single sheet across the desk, a comparison she'd built herself. 6 charts side by side. 6 notes almost word for word identical, differing only in the patient's name and the date. She told me she'd found the pattern 3 months earlier through a paralegal at another firm who'd handled the Kwan case, and had been quietly building the comparison ever since, waiting for either enough cases or enough courage from one family member willing to fight it in the open. I hadn't known, sitting down in her office that morning, that I was about to become that family member. I don't think she knew it yet either. I sat in that office and I thought about the 4 seconds it took me to remember the name of my blood pressure medication at Easter dinner, and I thought about Craig laughing, and I thought about Denise writing something on her phone, and for the first time in this whole thing, I felt something colder than anger. I felt like I understood exactly how this machine worked and how easily I could have been the 7th name in that folder instead of the man sitting across from the lawyer asking how to stop it. Miriam explained it plainly, no drama in her voice, the same way I used to explain to customers why a $5 hinge was actually the better buy over the $2 one. Dr. Wembley wasn't committing outright fraud in a way that was easy to prove in a single afternoon. She was writing vague, defensible notes based on minor, normal, human moments, a missed appointment here, a forgotten word there, and family members who were already scared about money or already resentful about caregiving were doing the rest of the work themselves, filing the petitions, hiring their own lawyers, pushing the process forward on their own motivation. The doctor's name was on 6 charts. The doctor's fingerprints, technically, were almost nowhere. So, what do we do? I asked her. We build a record she can't argue with, Miriam said. Starting today. And Harold, I need you to understand this is going to take months, and during those months, your daughter may very well finish what she started before we're ready to stop her. Are you prepared for that? I told her I was. I want to tell you honestly, in this moment, I wasn't sure that was true. What we built over the next several months was simple in idea and slow in practice. Every Sunday evening, 6 o'clock, the same time I used to call Tyler, I sat at the kitchen table in the house on Clifton Boulevard and recorded a video on my phone, dated, time-stamped. I read the front page of the Plain Dealer out loud to prove the date wasn't faked. I recited, from memory, the full table of contents of the Ohio Revised Code chapter on adult guardianship, section by section, because Miriam told me if this ever reached a courtroom, nothing would land harder than watching the man they said couldn't remember his own name recite statute numbers a licensed attorney would have to look up. I talked about my week. I named every customer who'd walked into the old hardware store on a given day 40 years ago if a memory of them surfaced, just to prove the wiring underneath was intact. Some weeks it felt ridiculous, an old man talking to a phone propped against a sugar bowl. Some weeks it felt like the only sane thing left in my life. Miriam had one more instruction for those Sundays that I almost argued with at the time. She told me to include, at least once a month, some small, honest admission of a real limitation, something true and slightly embarrassing, because a record with 0 flaws in it would look staged to a skeptical judge faster than a record with a few. So in August, I admitted on camera that I'd forgotten where I'd parked at the Giant Eagle on Detroit Avenue for a full 5 minutes and had to walk the whole lot twice before I found the Buick 2 rows over from where I remembered leaving it. In October, I admitted I'd started labeling my spice rack because I kept reaching for the cumin when I meant the cinnamon. Miriam said those 2 admissions, small and specific and slightly funny, would end up doing more work in that courtroom than any of the statute recitations because they proved I wasn't performing perfect competence. I was just an honest man describing an honest life, which happened to also be a completely sound one. There was one more piece to the record we were building that I didn't learn about until later, one I wasn't even part of. A nurse named Carol Johnson worked the front desk at Dr. Wembley's practice, had for 6 years, and had started keeping her own quiet notes after the Kwan family's paralegal came by asking questions in the spring. Carol never called me. She never called Denise either. She called Miriam's office directly in August, off the record at first, and told her that Dr. Wembley had a habit, an actual pattern Carol had watched develop over 18 months, of spending noticeably less time with patients whose adult children called ahead expressing concerns, and writing noticeably vaguer notes for exactly those patients afterward, as if the family's fear became the diagnosis before the appointment even started. Carol told Miriam she'd typed up dates and times from memory and her own desk calendar. Nothing she'd taken from the building, nothing that would get her fired for stealing records, just her own recollection of a pattern she couldn't unsee anymore. It wasn't enough on its own to prove anything, but paired with 6 identical charts, it was enough to tell Miriam she wasn't chasing a coincidence. She was chasing a habit. Meanwhile, Denise kept moving. In July, she stopped by unannounced with a folder of paperwork, power of attorney forms, and asked me to sign them just to make things easier down the road. I told her I wanted my own lawyer to look them over first. She got quiet in a way that wasn't quiet at all, the kind of quiet that has a temperature to it. "Dad, this doesn't have to be a whole thing," she said. "I'm just trying to protect you." I said I appreciated that and I still wanted my own lawyer. She left without the coffee she usually stayed for. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, a Thursday in late July, I think, I drove past the old shop on Detroit Avenue, the way I sometimes do when I need to think, and I sat in the Buick outside the phone repair store that used to be Feinstein Hardware. Looking at the tin ceiling, I could just barely see through the front window, and I thought about my father, who died at 71, with almost nothing in the bank because he never once let himself believe he deserved to build something that would outlast him. I thought about the trust, sitting quietly downtown, doing exactly what Ruth and I built it to do. And I thought for the first time in this whole ordeal, not about the fear of losing my house or my say in my own life, but about something closer to sorrow, that it had taken my own daughter trying to take those things from me to finally understand how much they were worth. In August, Craig called me, which he'd never done alone before, and told me in his insurance salesman voice that the family had concerns about me living alone with the stairs and had already started looking at 2 assisted living facilities, one in Westlake, one in North Olmsted, just to have options ready. I asked who the family was since nobody had called a family meeting I'd been invited to. He laughed that half-second too late again and changed the subject. Before he hung up, he added, almost as an afterthought, that the Westlake facility had a really nice memory care wing. "Just so you know, it's an option," a phrase that told me more about what was already decided than anything he'd said directly. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long while after that call, in the same kitchen chair I'd sit in every Sunday for the next 4 months, and I understood maybe for the first time completely that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a plan, moving forward on its own schedule, whether I agreed to it or not. In September, the cognitive assessment finally happened, the one Denise had scheduled back in June, because by then avoiding it looked worse than attending it. Dr. Wembley administered it herself. 40 minutes. Word recall, clock drawing, basic arithmetic. I answered every question correctly and calmly, the way I'd answer a customer asking where the drywall screws were. I remember the room during that assessment better than I remember most rooms from that whole year. Beige walls, a poster about flu shots, Dr. Wembley's reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, her voice pleasant and unhurried in a way that felt, looking back, almost rehearsed, like a script she delivered often enough that the warmth had worn into a groove. She asked me to draw a clock showing 10 past 11. I drew it correctly, numbers evenly spaced, hands in the right place. She asked me to remember 3 words, apple, table, penny, and recite them back after a 5-minute conversation about something else entirely. I got all 3. She asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s. I did that too, slower than I would have at 40, faster than she seemed to expect. When it ended, she smiled and said, "You did just fine, Harold." And I remember thinking, at the time, that fine sounded like a strange word for someone who'd apparently answered every single question correctly. 2 weeks later, Denise received a written summary in the mail as my emergency contact before I ever saw it myself, which Miriam later told me was itself a small procedural violation worth noting. The summary used the phrase mild cognitive decline, unsupported by 2 of the 4 subtest scores, which actually placed me in the above-average range for my age bracket. I remember reading that letter, sitting at my kitchen table in the same chair where I recorded 41 straight weeks of Sunday videos by then, and feeling something strange. Not fear anymore. Something closer to certainty. Everything holds until it doesn't. I finally understood which screw was loose, and it wasn't the one anybody in my family thought it was. In October, Denise filed the guardianship petition, Cuyahoga County Probate Court. She used Dr. Wembley's letter as her primary medical evidence. Craig was listed as co-petitioner. The filing asked the court to grant Denise full authority over my finances, my medical decisions, and my place of residence, citing my progressive cognitive impairment and my resistance to appropriate care planning, which is the polite legal phrase for me hiring my own lawyer instead of signing what she handed me. I got served with the papers on a Thursday afternoon in October, standing in my own driveway next to the Buick. A process server, who looked younger than Tyler, apologizing as he handed me the envelope. I want to tell you honestly, even knowing everything I knew by then, even with 41 weeks of video evidence and Miriam Okafor and Eleanor Vance's folder sitting in a locked drawer downtown, there was a moment standing in that driveway where I felt exactly as small and as powerless as Denise believed me to be. That's the part nobody tells you about being underestimated by your own child. Some small part of you starts to wonder if they're right. I read the petition twice standing in the driveway, the November wind cutting through my coat, before I could make myself go inside. It asked the court to strip me of the right to decide where I would live. It asked the court to give Denise the power to sell the house on Clifton Boulevard, the house I'd carried Ruth over the threshold of in 1979, without asking me first. It cited as its central piece of evidence a 5-week-old letter from a doctor whose license, though none of us knew it yet, was already sitting in a folder marked for state investigation. I called Miriam that night. She told me the hearing date. 6 weeks out. She told me to keep recording, keep living my life exactly as I always had, and to trust the process we'd been building since June. Then she told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, that turned out to matter more than anything else in this story. "Harold," she said, "I filed a formal complaint against Dr. Wembley with the Ohio State Medical Board 3 weeks ago, using the pattern across all 6 cases. They've opened an investigation. I can't guarantee the timing, but if it moves fast enough, it may reach the courtroom before your hearing does." She also told me something practical, something to occupy the 6 weeks besides worrying. She wanted a second opinion, a fresh, fully independent neuropsychological evaluation from a specialist with no connection to Dr. Wembley or her practice, done properly this time. 3 hours instead of 40 minutes. The kind of testing that measures more than a clock drawing and 3 words remembered. I drove myself to a clinic in Beechwood on a Wednesday morning in late October and sat through a battery of tests that left me more tired than any day I'd worked in the shop. Memory tests, attention tests, a test where I had to sort cards by rules that kept silently changing without anyone telling me the rule had changed. The specialist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Anita Reyes, called Miriam 2 days later with the results. "Every domain tested," she said, "placed me solidly within normal range for my age, several of them above average." There was no clinical basis, she wrote in her report, for any diagnosis of cognitive impairment, mild or otherwise. It was one more brick, quiet and unglamorous, laid down next to 8 months of Sunday videos and a folder with 6 names in it. I didn't sleep much between that call and the hearing date. I want to be honest about that too. 6 weeks felt like 6 years. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in early December. Courtroom 4 on the 2nd floor of the Cuyahoga County Probate Court building on Superior Avenue, the same street where Denise had first told a lawyer I couldn't remember my own name. It was cold that morning, the kind of gray Cleveland cold that gets into your knuckles. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to Ruth's funeral. Gus sat behind me in the gallery, along with Eleanor Vance herself, who Miriam had invited, and who squeezed my shoulder once before the judge came in and said nothing else. Denise sat at the petitioner's table with her own attorney, a younger man in an expensive suit, confident, the kind of confident that comes from believing the paperwork already tells the whole story. Craig sat beside her. Denise didn't look at me when I came in. She looked at a folder in front of her, organizing pages that were already in order, the way people organize things with their hands when they can't organize what's happening in their chest. Her attorney opened first. He was smooth. He walked the judge through the medical summary, the missed appointments, the storage unit incident reframed as evidence of confusion rather than a changed lock. The Easter dinner moment with the blood pressure medication stretched into a pattern of memory loss that existed mostly in retelling. He called Denise to the stand first, and she testified in a flat, rehearsed voice about how frightened she'd been watching me decline, how she'd only ever wanted to protect me, how every decision she'd made had come from love. I believed she believed it. That's what made it hard to sit through. Not that she was lying, but that she'd told herself this version of the story so many times it had become the only version she could see. He was building a story, and for about 20 minutes, watching the judge's face, I believed he was winning. Denise sat up a little straighter as he spoke. I saw something in her that looked, for just a moment, like relief, like she'd finally found the person who would confirm she'd been right to be scared all along. That's when Miriam stood up and asked the court's permission to introduce additional evidence not previously disclosed to opposing counsel. Evidence that had only become relevant, she said, in the past several days. The judge allowed it. Denise's attorney objected, then sat back down when the judge overruled him, a small crack already showing in his confidence that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Miriam's paralegal wheeled in a small screen. The room went quiet in that particular courtroom way, papers stopping mid-shuffle, the bailiff by the door shifting his weight, Craig leaning forward slightly like a man trying to see around a corner before he's ready to. The first video played. Me, at my kitchen table, June 9th, reading the front page headline out loud, the date visible on the newspaper in my hands. Then July, then August. Miriam didn't play all 41 weeks. She'd told me beforehand she only needed 6 or 7 of the strongest, spaced across the full period, to establish an unbroken record. She played the one where I recited the entire table of contents of Ohio Revised Code, Chapter 2111 on adult guardianship, section by section, without a single pause. 6 days before Denise's attorney would later stand in this same room and cite Section 2111.02 incorrectly, off by one subsection, a mistake I caught before Miriam even had to point it out to the judge. I watched Denise's face while the videos played. Not her attorney's face, not the judge's, hers. I watched something shift in it, slowly, the confidence draining out and something else moving in behind it that I recognized, because I'd seen it on her face once before, at 7 years old, the day she broke a neighbor's window with a baseball and stood frozen, realizing the story she'd already told herself about what would happen next wasn't the story that was actually about to happen. Then Miriam introduced the second piece, the medical board complaint, the pattern across 6 patients. Eleanor Vance's name entered into the record, with Eleanor's own written consent sitting 3 feet behind me in the gallery. Miriam explained calmly, without raising her voice once, the way I'd explained countless times in my own shop why the cheap hinge always fails first, that the medical opinion underpinning this entire petition had been generated by a physician currently under active state investigation for a documented pattern of vague, clinically unsupported cognitive decline diagnoses issued specifically in the context of family guardianship disputes. Craig leaned over and whispered something to Denise's attorney, urgent, his hand gesturing at the screen. The attorney shook his head once, sharply, the gesture of a man realizing the ground under his argument had shifted while he was still mid-sentence. Denise didn't whisper to anyone. She sat with both hands flat on the table in front of her, staring at the paused image on the screen, my own face frozen, mid-sentence reciting a statute number, and I watched her jaw work like she was trying to find a sentence that wasn't there yet. Denise's attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that, because it would have been easy to. I sat at that table, in Ruth's memory of teaching me not to make a scene even when I'd earned the right to, and I said nothing. And Denise did not look at me once during those 15 minutes, and Craig excused himself to the hallway and didn't come back until the judge returned. When the recess ended, the judge asked Denise's attorney directly, before he could say another word, whether he'd been aware of the medical board investigation into his client's central piece of evidence when he filed the petition. He said no. The judge asked Denise the same question. She said no as well, quietly, and then added, unprompted, that she hadn't known about Eleanor Vance either. Hadn't known there were 5 other families going through some version of exactly this. Her voice cracked on the word 5. The judge, an older man named Judge Alvarez, who I later learned had presided over guardianship cases for 19 years, looked at her for a long moment and said something I've thought about often since. Ms. Feinstein Cole, fear is not evidence. I understand you were afraid. But your father sat in a chair in my courtroom this morning and recited a section of the Ohio Revised Code that your own attorney cited incorrectly 20 minutes ago. I would ask you to sit with that fact for a while. Nobody in the room said anything after that. Craig looked at the floor. Denise looked at me, finally, for the first time since I'd walked in that morning, and I saw in her face not defeat exactly, but the specific look of someone watching a story they'd told themselves for a year collapse all at once under its own weight. When the hearing resumed, Denise's attorney withdrew the petition, not dismissed by the court, withdrawn by his own request, which Miriam later told me was the version of losing that let everyone leave the room with slightly less blood on the floor. And I understood, watching Denise's shoulders drop, that even in this moment she was grateful for that mercy, whether she could say so yet or not. Thank you for sticking with the story this far. If this is landing for you, the like button really does help more people find it, so go ahead and tap it now before we keep going. The petition was formally withdrawn and dismissed with prejudice that same morning. 2 weeks later, the Ohio State Medical Board suspended Dr. Patricia Wembley's license pending a full investigation, citing the pattern across all 6 documented cases. Eleanor Vance's guardianship case among them, reopened and reversed within the month once the underlying medical claim collapsed. That's most of the story, the part with paperwork in it. What happened after matters more to me. Denise called me 9 days after the hearing. Not to apologize, not yet. She wasn't ready for that. She asked if she could come by. I said yes. She stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen with the sugar bowl I'd propped my phone against 41 Sunday nights in a row, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen since she was small. Not performing it, just cracked open by it. She said she'd been so afraid of the money running out, of ending up responsible for me the way she'd watched her own mother's sister end up responsible for a parent alone, drowning. That she'd convinced herself controlling the outcome was the same thing as protecting me. I told her I understood being afraid. I told her being afraid never gave anyone the right to decide someone else couldn't remember their own name. She nodded. She didn't argue. That was new. Craig was the first one, oddly, to actually change something. Not Denise, not right away. He started driving up on Wednesday evenings, alone, to help me with small things around the house, the gutters, the storm door that never quite latched, and after the 3rd or 4th visit, he finally said, standing on a ladder with his back to me, that he'd known some of what Denise was doing wasn't right, and he'd gone along with it because it was easier than being the one who said no. I didn't forgive him out loud that day. I let him keep coming back, which I've learned is its own kind of forgiveness, the slower kind, the kind you actually mean. By spring, he'd started bringing his own toolbox instead of borrowing mine. Small tools, nothing fancy, but I noticed, and I think he wanted me to notice, that he'd started actually learning how to use them instead of just standing there handing me whatever I asked for. I want to tell you about one more Sunday, this past spring, because it's the one that actually feels like the ending to me, more than the courtroom does. Denise, Craig, and Tyler came over at 6, the way they do now. And Tyler asked if he could see the spice rack I'd labeled back in October, the one Miriam said would matter more than any statute. I showed him. He read the little handwritten labels, cumin, cinnamon, paprika, and started laughing, really laughing, and said, "Grandpa, this is the least dramatic piece of evidence I've ever heard of." I told him that was sort of the point. Denise, standing in the kitchen doorway, wasn't laughing. She was just watching the two of us, quiet, and when I caught her eye, she didn't look away this time. She just nodded, small, like she was finally willing to let this be an ordinary Sunday instead of something she had to manage or fix or fear. Tyler started picking up on the first ring most Sundays after that. He asked me once, a few months later, almost shy about it, if he could see one of the videos. I showed him the one from October, the statute recitation. He watched the whole thing and then he looked at me and said, "Grandpa, that's kind of terrifying, honestly." And I laughed for the first time in months, a real laugh, because it was. Eleanor Vance's case, the one that started this whole thread of the story for me, was reopened that January and reversed by March. Her son's petition dismissed once the same medical claim that had propped it up collapsed under the board suspension of Dr. Wembley's license. Eleanor called me herself in April, the first time we'd ever spoken directly, just to say thank you, and to tell me she'd gone back to teaching piano lessons out of her own living room on Tuesday afternoons again, in the house her son had nearly sold out from under her. I told her she didn't owe me a thank you. She told me she was going to give me one anyway, and hung up before I could argue, which made me laugh for the second time that year. Denise still hasn't fully forgiven herself, I don't think. There are things you don't get to undo just by saying sorry, and to her credit, she's never asked me to pretend otherwise. What she has done is show up every Sunday now, not just Tyler, all three of them, 6 o'clock. The same time I used to sit alone at that table talking to a phone. Last month she asked if she could keep one of the ledgers from my father's old shop, the ones that had been sitting in that storage unit with the changed lock, and I gave it to her. And she didn't ask why I still had the second set of books nobody in the family had ever seen, the ones that explain where the trust money actually came from all those years. I think she already understood by then that the real inheritance was never the money. Miriam sent me a card at Christmas, the first one she'd ever sent a client in 22 years of practice, she told me later. And inside it, she'd written a single line. "Some cases you win with a better argument. This one you won by simply telling the truth on camera every week for 8 months and refusing to stop." I keep that card in the same drawer as Ruth's recipe box, which is probably the highest compliment I'm capable of giving anything. Gus and I still meet on Sundays too, before the family calls, in my basement, taking apart the same old pocket watch we've been fixing on and off for 2 years now because neither of us is in any particular hurry to finish it. He asked me once, not long after the hearing, if I regretted keeping the trust a secret for so long. All those years of letting my own family believe I was just an old man who'd sold nails and hinges. I told him no. I told him it turned out to be the only thing that saved me. In the end, not the money itself, but the discipline underneath it, the habit of quietly proving who I was with evidence instead of arguing about it with feeling. "Everything holds until it doesn't," I told him. "You just have to know which screw is loose." And sometimes, Gus said, setting down the little screwdriver, it turns out the whole time it was never really about the screw at all. It was about who was willing to actually check. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Family Story Archives. I will see you on the next one.